This feels bad, man. Not gonna lie, I'm kinda depressed right now. Taking everything that's happening at Creative Assembly into account, this video will probably not be the best news, but sadly that's how things are sometimes. But my job is to tell you the truth. Total War Pharaoh is a waste of your time, and here's why. Do you like epic strategy games? The kind that includes badass soldiers, a ton of varied cavalry, from the heavy armor to the light and treacherous? Or what about siege artillery, to really spice up the experience? Perhaps you're one who prefer naval battles, whether in the ancient world or the more up-to-date Age of Sail kind? Are you in it for the grand scope campaigns with a bunch of factions and cultures spanning hundreds of years? Or do you prefer the tight and focused ones, where there is a clear struggle and awesome historical actors? If you're anything like me, all of these reasons are why you love Total War. At least, why you loved Total War. Because even though Total War Pharaoh has its merits, it manages to be the single least interesting, most boring, most frustrating, and most copy-pasted Total War game I have ever played. It's not all bad, as we'll get to, but that's not a good start for the most expensive game in the series of all time, and the first quote-unquote fully historical Total War game in God knows how many years. If you're into sci-fi, however, Honkai Star Rail is a new multi-platform galactic fantasy RPG that just received a massive update. Honkai Star Rail is a free cross-platform RPG available on both PC, mobile, and PS5, and in version 1.4, you'll be experiencing an all-new City of Belobog story. With more than $80 million in just 6 months, you'll assume the role of a trailblazer, exploring different worlds and immersing yourself in an adventure filled with amazing animations and fantastic music. The game's turn-based combat system is easy to pick up, but highly tactical, and with over 20 charming playable characters and their stories, you'll be uncovering the secrets and puzzles of this rich semi-open world in style. In this massive update, Honkai Star Rail introduces new limited-time 5-star heroes and characters. Jingliu is a mysterious legendary female hero favoring her sword, and was a general aboard the Jiangsu, and uses ice and destruction powers to deal massive damage. The duo of Topaz and Numbi is also here. Topaz might look innocent, but she's actually a director of business, and by summoning Numbi, uses fire and hunt abilities to target single enemies for superior damage. This latest version 1.4 further updates the main story of the mysterious city of Belobog, with 2 new maps, and Seal will finally make a comeback. Log into Honkai Star Rail for 7 days to claim 10 Star Rail special passes for free and try to draw Jingliu or Topaz. Make sure to download Honkai Star Rail now by using the link in the description below and use your redemption code to redeem 50 Stellar Jade. Thank you so much to Hoyoverse for sponsoring this video. And listen, I'm not saying that a game needs to be everything you think you want, because how else do you know what you like and not like if you never try anything new? But still, the point stands that strategy games are supposed to be fun. Historical accuracy, different time periods, and geographical locations are only as good as they are fun to play, because if it's not fun, then what's the point? Perhaps more important than your money is your time after all. I'm not spending thousands of hours in EU4 purely because it's so historically authentic. I play it because the historical authenticity is made fun, and because the game goes to great lengths to make aspects of history fun, not the other way around or something different entirely. It's not for nothing that Total War has yet to make a Stone Age game, because why would you? Similarly, the Bronze Age is so long ago that so many features of what I want from a Total War game, or any game for that matter, is not yet present. The entire reason why certain games do better than others often comes down to the simple fact that they take place in different settings, because they are more popular, again, because of what they offer. I'm saying this because to me, the setting of a game has a lot to say when it comes to whether I'll find it compelling or not. And as you watch this review, I hope you take that into account. These are my opinions, they're not necessarily yours, but if you know me and hopefully know my taste in Total War, you'll probably be able to gauge your own interest and whether you love or hate the same things that I do. And I'll say this right away as well. Pharaoh was never the title I wanted, nor the setting I wanted, but damn it if I'm not gonna stay cautiously optimistic until I've played the game myself and made up my own mind about it. And now, that's what I've done. And yes, stick with me and we'll address everything. And I mean everything. Yes, even the Troy copy-paste criticism. I want to start with the positives because I feel like it's important that you know that I'm not a one-dimensional reviewer. And I can recognize that every product may have positive signs, whether I like the whole package or not. And on the surface, Pharaoh is not a bad nor a low quality product on its own. I mean, come from most other series and what's here might seem like abundance to you. The campaign map is stylistic and beautiful, depicting the Near East on a level never seen before. I'm a sucker for special effects, and the one thing Pharaoh has that I've never seen replicated as beautifully is this magnificent fog of war effect, which looks like thick volumetric-like clouds. Just look at how thick and fat and absolutely succulent this shroud is. If this is what the clouds look like, now the only question I remain with is, what do they taste like? It's awesome that the Nile is so massive now that we can actually sail it up and down, meaning we have avenues for shortcuts. I love the return of the resource system from Troy, meaning instead of worrying just about making money, we actually have to cultivate and amass resources of various types to build and recruit what we want. Pharaoh offers some cool mechanics which we will get into further, and I find siege maps to be well designed and beautiful. Those are my favorite things about this game. I want to say this with as little ambiguity as possible. From the outset and/or onset, Pharaoh feels identical to Troy, and I mean identical. If I'd heard nothing about Pharaoh and then we were given it to play, I would have told you it had to be an expansion, because every part of this game screams Troy DNA. From the way you select your character, to the fact that Pharaoh is character-based, to the city model design philosophy, the overall graphics are virtually completely unchanged. Almost every click you ever make sounds virtually the exact same as they did in Troy. The units mostly look and feel the same, only not Greek. And the music, while nice, can literally be mistaken for Troy's, as it's very non-melodic and ambient. I swear, the entire vibe, look, and feel of this game is as if this was an expansion or a reskin, and I'm sure if modding tools were out for Troy, that this could have been the exact result. And it feels kinda weird complaining about the similarities to Troy when that's a game I actually quite liked, at least after the Mythos update released. But I never said I wanted a Troy 2, and certainly not a different game that mimics almost every aspect of it. I find that it diminishes the entire experience when you want to feel different and fresh because of how similar they are. It's not like this is some expansion or standalone expansion like Napoleon for Empire or anything. No, it's marketed and sold as a fully independent standalone title. And might I add again, sold at the highest price of any Total War game ever. For a game with such high demands for its prospective players, I think some demands and wishes are warranted from our side as well. And when I think of how new non-Warhammer Total War games always strive to look distinctly unique, this is just not acceptable at all. The closest we have might be Rome and Medieval 2, but the difference is that both of these UIs were amazing, and actually that was over 15 years ago, so I'll cut them some slack here. I get that Troy and Pharaoh take place around the same time, but this is literally not Troy 2. So more variation and uniqueness would have gone a long way here, especially since Pharaoh also inherits that rather punk feel and sound of Troy in various ways, one that makes it feel less like a down-to-earth historical game in my opinion. Either way, enough about the Troy talk. Much like Troy, Pharaoh makes the choice of letting us choose between characters as opposed to kingdoms. This is an important distinction because it has ramifications for how easy this world is to navigate, and has essentially been the status quo of Total War games since Warhammer. The only difference between Warhammer and historical titles is that it kinda makes sense in Warhammer, where every faction is so distinct. And I might be alone in this, but to me, I'm having a much harder and unnecessary time managing Total War game as characters, because the faction list becomes drastically longer and more confusing. And I'm not talking about the playable factions here. There were so many characters in Troy, and more than half of them became just random names to me. The same went for Three Kingdoms, which was even worse because it was all Chinese names instead of Chinese kingdoms and fiefdoms. And now the case is the same for Pharaoh, where instead of actual kingdoms, there are dozens of various characters up and down the Nile vying for the same kingdom, let alone the other characters up the Levant and into Anatolia. For good measure, I'll give you a disclaimer. I know very little about New Kingdom Egypt or the Bronze Age collapse, so I'm not claiming to be some expert. But frankly, I doubt the majority of people playing this game will be Bronze Age experts, but people who think it will be awesome to play as Egypt in this era. And of course, many of those might be disappointed when they don't ever find Egypt as a starting faction. In fact, there are no recognizable kingdom names as factions, but rather cultures and then characters within said cultures. These characters all begin with less than a handful of settlements in the beginning. In fact, most of them begin with like 2 or 3 towns in the same province, meaning every faction, yes, even the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, who's supposed to kinda be the hardcore but still big bad wolf, is tiny in comparison to what historical Total War empires have been in the past. In this game, he's only one character of course, and not his empire. Imagine if Attila was made the same way. You were playing as the Emperor of the East and only controlled Constantinople and maybe Nicaea. Every other part of your empire were controlled by other named characters. Some Flavius here and Julius there, but all of them owned like one province or less, and the map had no actual mention of the Eastern Roman Empire, of course. No, your faction was just called Augustus Flavius or some variation of that. It would have been chaos. Thing is, what I love about Total War isn't first and foremost the characters. They are of course a part of it, but it's about leading a state and then deal with everything that goes on in that state. You still do this to a large extent with Pharaoh, of course, de facto, but I'm talking about the optics here and how this major design and user experience choice changes how it feels to actually play these campaigns, and importantly, to get a legible overview of what's going on in the world. Because to me, it's never been harder to find your place in the world, and it's not just about the character focus either. I want to talk about something I've never heard anyone talk about before, and it's very relevant to every second of campaign play in Pharaoh. With Warhammer 2 onward, Creative Assembly force changed a fundamental aspect of every campaign, the way camera zoom works. In every Total War game until Warhammer 1, zoom worked in a swoop-down fashion, meaning you had a fairly wide field of view of the map at most if not all times. It mimicked how it often was on the battlefield as well, and I loved that. But now, that original tried and true zoom feature has been completely replaced. There's not even an option of using the original version, by the straight up vertical up and down zoom. And I'll tell you why this is such a big problem right now. You see, Total War Pharaoh's map is large, but there's not necessarily a whole lot of cities here. In fact, for the most part, there is a ton of mostly empty space. Now when I play strategy games, I like to actually be able to see what's out in the world. I like to look at the map at a glance and understand what I'm up against. But with Pharaoh, this is all I see. Basically nothing. This field of view is essentially useless to me and only works at the top level, which is admittedly awesome, and I love that the map transitions smoothly into that beautiful colored terrain, but it's this regular campaign map level that just drives me crazy. I feel so claustrophobic in Pharaoh for this reason, and the reason why I didn't feel like it in Troy, I realized, is because Troy had so many more cities close together. Everything you needed was right there anyway, but in Pharaoh, there can be so much space between what you see and where you want to go. Either way, rant over, but this issue is gnawing at me literally at all times. Okay, let's actually touch on this campaign map. Pharaoh's map is beautiful, with vast deserts, some nice luscious spacious, mountains, and everything in between. The design here is all fine and dandy, but I will say that 3 whole years later, it really is a shame that Pharaoh looks identical to Troy in the assets used here. I mean, you really can't tell the difference. The fact that it doesn't contain some of the improvements found in Warhammer 3's version of the engine is also disappointing. The fact that there's so much empty space doesn't work in its favor. But to remedy this, CA Sophia tries to innovate by creating so-called outposts, one-building hotspots that serve a purpose. In many ways, these are reminiscent of the towns and villages of Empire and Shogun 2, where you have these one-building settlements connected to cities. But while I like that Pharaoh is inspired by this older system and genuinely introduces an upgrade to the last few Total War games, this new version is just not it. First of all, outposts are not controlled by growth or populations, but is only limited by your resources, meaning you could construct every outpost tied to a city right away. Second, outposts are not tied to resources, since those are already integrated into your settlements, even though certain types of outposts can increase resource gain. Now this might not sound like a bad thing, but it makes it so outposts feel less valuable and integral. And finally, outposts cannot be sieged, and they cannot be directly fought over. The only thing outposts can be by foreign armies is either left alone or sacked. You can't even truly station your army in them. But admittedly, a special fort outpost will allow you to offload units so they can help defend the settlement if it's attacked. Fort outposts can also actually be sieged, which is awesome. But they can't be occupied by the sieging army, only, again, sacked or razed, which severely diminishes their awesomeness. It's by far the most interactive these outposts will come on their own. The reason you'd put units in the outposts is because they demand less resources than having them in an army stationed in a city. Outposts are mainly good for 2 things, and those are giving you their positive province modifiers or positive army modifiers. Both of these are fine, and I actually think it's pretty cool that interacting with the different outpost types with your army can net you valuable buffs, like reducing upkeep or improved movement speeds. In fact, it becomes vitally important to do so, because resources are rather scarce in Pharaoh, and what's more, there is so darn much desert here, meaning you do well to stop by these outposts to remove attrition debuffs. I will say though that it again feels a bit like an unrealistic gamification of the experience, and just being able to remove the protective and defensive effects one faction may gain from having desert between them and the enemy does feel a bit like cheating. It's especially kinda weird when there are special units here that can actually circumvent desert attrition, which I feel like the game should make more use of instead of attrition immune armies on the whole. The problem though is that because of all of these mentioned factors, outposts end up feeling like static hotspots rather than something you can or even want to protect. In Empire, settlements actually felt like living entities, although much smaller than the actual cities. And the same went for Shogun 2, where they even became integrated parts of the city UI. But in Pharaoh, not only does it feel like a campaign version of those RTS watchtowers in Warhammer 3 battles, in other words, lifeless, but since they don't feel organic, they're not doing anything for my sense of immersion. If Total War is so set on bringing back actual villages, then actually do it, and let them grow to become a few different tiers and even be able to be fought over. But if you want these kind of outposts, then a much better system would have it so armies themselves could place these outposts wherever they wanted, essentially making for an expanded fort system. Like imagine how awesome it would be if you could actually have your army raise forts or military outposts or administration centers in various parts of your province, where you wanted them to be. It'll make the player feel so much closer to these posts because they built it, and now they have to defend them. You could even make it so that you'd have to send a portion of your population or workers to those outposts to have them built, and a whole system could be built around them. At this point, the outposts just feel kinda half-baked, and while they might be adding to certain parts of gameplay, they're not adding to the immersion or the sense of empire building, and that is a missed opportunity. For cities themselves though, we need to dig a bit deeper. Cities function for the most part in the same way as they have for the past 10 years, but with an important addition. Settlement growth has been switched with available workforce. In Pharaoh, every building demands that you have enough workforce to produce, and if you lack that number, then you won't be able to build them no matter how many resources you have. In this way, workforce becomes a resource on its own, and will limit how much you can build or even prevent you from raising a particularly large building if you don't have the number of workers in your settlement. Workers do grow over time and can be increased by raising certain buildings, however. But what's interesting is that your available workforce, i.e. the number of workers not currently working and who are expendable, impacts other aspects of Empire. A low available workforce means more happiness since people are working. A high number of available workforce will create discontent since people are technically out of a job. But a much higher availability will in turn net you more recruitment slots, making it easier to muster armies quicker. This is actually quite a genius mechanic, meaning that if you really focus on it and manage to outweigh the public order debuff, you can essentially simulate a population that's being primed for war. This is a really cool system, but here's the thing. I desperately wish we had a separate population system here that also interacted with the workforce. Right now, Pharaoh, like so many other aspects of modern Total War, is aimed at creating gameplay systems, not actual immersion. So while the workforce system is cool on its own, it doesn't underpin an immersive or holistic population system that could have gone so much further in simulating various aspects of Egyptian, Canaanite, or Hittite societies. In this way, even though workforce takes it a step further and has an actual impact on what you can build or even recruit, it's only a minor step forward and doesn't actually address the main issue. In a way, it's very much like the outpost system, unfulfilled potential. Another building innovation is the fact that we can, through the use of the gold resource, instant construct buildings. I gotta say, I hate this mechanic because it feels like such a cheat. I understand mechanics that over time speed up construction or something, but instantly? Really? I swear, when combined with the workers mechanic, the building slots which are essentially tiles, and this gold insta-build, Total War has never felt more like I'm playing a civilization game, and that is not a development I want at all. Civilization is so devoid of historical immersion or realism that I actively barf in its general direction, so seeing Total War move to its more gamified system is depressing. And listen, I understand where CA wants to go here. After all, it's just an option, and options are mostly good to have. But insta-building? That is such a radical move away from what Total War is, and I don't like it. On the contrary, if anything should have changed, it's how recruitment works. I really like that in Thrones of Britannia or 3K, you had to actively wait several turns for your armies to muster, meaning you couldn't just instantly spawn units to your armies. That was a good mechanic, but for some reason it's not replicated again, since of course it's not. In most respects, Pharaoh's city UI is similar to Troy's and Warhammer's, but there's one aspect that has me tearing my hair out, and that is the color scheme. First of all, it's no secret that I'm no fan of the abstract UI system, i.e. building icons that are cartoons or just symbols rather than actual immersive images like the ones in the original Rome. But at least in Troy, the buildings were divided by color schemes, making it a tad easier to understand what was what. But in Pharaoh, every building icon follows the exact same scheme of white and gold on a navy background, making it almost impossible to intuitively understand what you've built. I find myself constantly hovering over the various icons to remind myself of what's there. The moral of the story here is that Total War City UI has become way too abstract for its own good, and it's been a process 10 years in the making, ending in a system where a veteran player needs to squint and take extra time to grasp what he's built. It takes a few extra seconds every time, and even though this might not sound like a lot, here's the problem. Even if immersion was out of the picture, it is vital that strategy games create systems that works at a glance. It's easy for me to tell what buildings I've built in Rome because it's literally showing me, but it's very hard to tell exactly what I've raised in Pharaoh without having to hover over the icons every time. Of course, the building slots return from Total War's past, doing little to innovate when it comes to the feeling of offering true cities and societies. On the positive side, edicts have arguably never been better, now offering a variety of them and with many offering bonuses in exchange for negatives elsewhere, forcing you to prioritize and choose which resources you want more of, and which you can sacrifice at least in the short term. That's really great actually, and again, I don't think edicts have been made much better than this in the past. If we're talking about army stances, they're for all intents and purposes the same as the one we come to know in the past decade of Total War as well, with little to no meaningful changes, and again, I think it's sad that outposts aren't tied to armies in the way I described earlier, and that armies can't raise forts or watchtowers. This brings us to the actual meat of Pharaoh, the campaign systems behind the surface layer. You see, ever since Warhammer, Total War has focused on creating unique systems for every faction, making them in some specific ways inherently different from the rest of the faction roster. Pharaoh does this in a few ways. The wholly unique character mechanic revolves around two aspects that activate at something called Shemsu Hor. Am I allowed to say that? Essentially the end of the season in Egypt. You can now do one of two things. If you haven't yet activated your ability, you will receive your character's innate boon at the end of the season, which often is a very powerful ability. For Talseret, it allows her to quick build any building instantly without the use of gold, which can be incredibly powerful if you choose to spend it on a project like the Tier 5 main settlement building. These can also be stacked, meaning you get more of these abilities if you choose not to use them. If not, you can also choose to activate the ability as soon as you can, which again will yield various results depending on your character. Talseret will have the massive boon of being able to instantly gather the production output of parts of her faction, but only from the province she's currently in, so make sure she's in a place where you're producing a ton of stuff. For Ramses, his abilities are more war-based, meaning he can wait for the opportunity to recruit special Medjay units, or he can be able to use the March ability and attack an enemy target at the same time. I think these features are quite awesome frankly, and feels a lot more like playing to characters' natural strengths rather than a gamified mechanic, but it is something I could live without. Other ways Pharaoh focuses on characters come down to features that are rather cool, but not necessarily well portrayed. It is genuinely a good thing that generals can accumulate traits depending on the situation they're in, and we can even see what kind of situations will trigger them. These are the kinds of dynamic traits we saw in games like Medieval 2, which is great, and it's also cool that the traits can be enhanced or even diminished depending on the general's continued actions. But as is so often the case, I have a few comments on this. First of all, I feel like the UI is a bit finicky and slow here, meaning I have to hover over too many things and wait for windows to pop up that I kinda zone out. I don't know why I feel this way with so many aspects of Pharaoh's UI tooltips, but I just do. They feel too cumbersome for some reason, take too hard to pop up, it's hard to define exactly, and I really do feel like it's a problem. One example is when you're checking something and the pop-up window seems to be cut off by the screen, or when you're hovering over something but the pop-up window now blocks the other options I have, meaning I need to actively move back and forth just to check a simple building tree. But perhaps the single worst screen is this character screen, where I find either the colors or the symbols or both to be quite illegible. First of all, I always forget which row does what, so I hover over to see, but because the tooltip isn't instant, it takes a moment before it pops up. It does this every time. And then to find out which title I want for my characters later on, I need to figure out which of these very similar symbols correspond to which level to which title, and then go back up and click the right one. I don't know if this even makes sense to you, but it's literally crossing my eyes just thinking about it. And even though I think I get what CA is going for here, sometimes less is actually more. And I think it would have gone a long way to make the UI smaller, but more legible and distinct. I really didn't have any of these UI problems with Troy, for example, but for some reason I have them absolutely non-stop in Pharaoh, which really is driving me mad at this point. I'm beginning to wonder whether I feel like Total War's dedication windows are just getting way too large for their own good, because literally each and every one of the menus here feel like they're taking up the entire screen, and thus removing me from the actual game world. This goes for the major joint mechanics, like the court system. The court is essentially where the major Egyptian and Hittite players will aim to be, enabling major bonuses for holding their positions. For example, the treasurer position will enable its holder to essentially collect taxes from foreign cities, change the cost of various aspects of government, and even use plots to embezzle funds from the other court positions. To even get into court positions, you have to use leverage, of which you gain a base number each turn. Leverage lets you gather favor with current court members to begin plots and even improving your chance of having them succeed. There is a number of options here, but the general rule is use court actions to gain favor with court members, use court actions and favor to plot against court members, use court actions to improve court mechanic chances, assume court positions, and fight off other plots or make your own. Thing is, any plot will complete once the Shemsu horse season ends, and you therefore have until then to tie up loose ends. If you manage to get another character out of their position, you may then buy your way into a council position. That's okay enough, but it is rather weird that when the game says complete this plot to become the new treasurer, that I don't automatically become the new treasurer. Because if I don't pay for the seat, another person just takes it the next turn, which is kinda messed up. I think the court mechanic is interesting, but again, it feels unfulfilled and unfulfilling. Being a court member doesn't actually net you a title or respect from other factions. It doesn't give you a salary or better relations with the current pharaoh, for example, and what's kinda strange is that there are very few or no events occurring that are relevant to your position. Some events happen where you can choose to trade your turn's leverage points in exchange for gold, but that's not relevant to your position at all, although it can be a good trade if you're short on the shiny stuff. This lends itself to a point that is important that I convey to you, namely that I don't feel like I belong in this world. And I realize that's a weird thing to say, but it's true. My perhaps biggest issue with Pharaoh is that it doesn't do enough to immerse me into this Bronze Age period, and I'm left wondering what I'm doing here at all. It's a sensation I've never really felt in Total War games before, because most of them are either so familiar to me, i.e. in Medieval 2, I wish to reclaim the Frankish borders as France without really needing incentives, or in Empire, where I'm so familiar with the time period that creating various scenarios myself is part of the fun. But at least in Medieval 2, we have the Crusades mechanic, which at least to a certain extent manages to tie things up neatly and create a sense of purpose for both Catholics and Muslims. In Napoleon, you have a very clear-cut war going on, either for or against France, and in Rome, it's basically Roman civilization versus the rest, or of course reclaiming Alexander's legacy and all that. Even in Warhammer, it's easy to see how one can create a story of humanity versus chaos spawns. Or in an even closer example, in Troy, where we have the Achaeans versus the Trojans as the backdrop. Essentially two major alliances duking it out. But in Pharaoh, we have a rather poor mix. The game is character focused in a series which is best served through kingdoms. And for the most part, our characters live in kingdoms that are about to fall, but for what reason is kind of left out. The intro sequence describes a pharaoh who's ruled well, but that his reign is soon coming to an end. And then you kinda just toss into this world with no real motivation other than take your character to the top kinda thing. And because we're mostly fighting intra-faction characters here, it's even more obscure than if the game was centered around actually playing as Egypt versus Canaan or Egyptian rebels or anything of the sort. There are no real missions in the game, which could have triggered a sense of purpose. Instead, we have systems that gain you legitimacy, and legitimacy is essentially what you need to join the civil wars and become the leader yourself. Legitimacy can then be used to obtain other boons, which are admittedly very cool, like having you focus on warfare or mending relations with other characters. But the focus on the core system and civil war is kind of an issue in an immersion sense, because we're lacking that crucial step between that lower level sense of a complete sandbox campaign and the very top layer of Pharaoh's civil war. I need more missions, not just random ambitions, but more personalized ambitions and needs. I mean, this is a character-focused game after all, and without those types of things, I just don't feel emotionally attached. and you really can't have it both ways. I mean, in Warhammer, it's clear that Karl Franz needs to unite his empire and take on the Chaos Hordes. And in Troy, it's evident that Paris has to take care of Helen and defend against the incoming Achaean forces. I mean, even their very own personal mechanics are all about this, whether it's France's United Empire mechanic or Paris's combined Helen moods and his bid to gain the city of Troy. But in Pharaoh, there's really nothing like this. Court mechanics are open to everyone, and the Civil War and Pharaoh mechanics are also open to everyone. The only joint mechanics thing that can be made unique to the characters of Pharaoh are the royal traditions, where you can only choose one direction per campaign. But again, these are joint mechanics, so you can choose whichever of these you want with every character in every campaign. Personally, I think every royal tradition or ancient legacy should have been open to every faction from a culture, since it seems really weird that you can only choose to either focus on making grand monuments or be able to send caravans across the world. And I'll say this, I love the caravan system in Pharaoh. It's very reminiscent of the one used by Cathay in Warhammer 3, but it's a lot better. Sending caravans in Pharaoh, again, locked behind royal traditions, which will only unlock about a dozen turns into the campaign and will lock other traditions away, is just awesome. Essentially, you can load up your cart with resources and special items you've collected, and then send it to regions in the world that offer and demand certain goods. Depending on where the cart goes, you'll get more or less for your loaded goods and can then trade it for items you might need. Some items will net you instant resources, while others will give you a boost over time, and you can even purchase equipable items for your characters. I actually really like how resources are symbolized by the depiction of the specific good. So large stone blocks indicates that it will net you a large number of stone resources, and in this way, it's a really good intuitive system. The caravan takes a few turns to reach its destination, and then a similar amount of turns to come back. There are no surprise scenarios here like there is in Warhammer 3, so there are no attacks along your caravan's route, and you don't have to equip a caravan guard, for example, which would have been an okay feature, I guess, but honestly, they're not necessarily needed. What is weird and hard to understand though is why you can trade the items you can, and why you can't load other items. For example, as Tausret, I own provinces that specialize in everything from food production to gold, stone, and bronze, but I can only make certain goods based on food or wood. This makes no sense to me, and the game doesn't tell me where these items come from in my realm, nor what it takes to be able to make other items. Or indeed why I'm not able to trade other types of items, again, despite my realm producing much more than just food and wood. Again though, I'm kind of confused by Pharaoh's campaign design choice, since so much of it is locked behind various stages of the game. I mean, the main mechanic of collapse is understandably locked behind the system that degrades as cities are destroyed or cultural places are ravaged. But even the court system, even the Pharaoh and Civil War menu, and even the royal traditions are for some reason scheduled to arrive after a few rotations of the Shemsu Hor season, which personally I don't really get. Maybe it's a way for the game to supposedly ease you into it, but instead of doing that, it kinda just left me confused, and I feel like the game is just relatively weirdly paced. I have nothing against features opening up as you go. After all, I play EU4, like a lot, where you need to wait a few years before you unlock things like technology groups. But the difference is that in EU4, you're always working towards opening new ones, even your first one, and you can even see which groups you are able to unlock once you have gathered enough points to do so. But in Pharaoh, you're not gathering points, and you can't even open the locked menus. You just have to wait an unnamed amount of time for these features. After about a dozen turns or so though, most of the mechanics will have opened up to you. But still, it just makes for a rather strange first few turns where you're wondering what's going on, and why you don't have access to all of the mechanics from the get-go. Another system like this, but which works kinda well, is the religious system. Pharaoh has a system of worship where essentially every character can worship and devote themselves to various deities. In the beginning, you have access to just a select few from your own culture, but then discover new gods by conquering new regions where worship of those gods are present. It's a cool system and it makes religion feel a lot more granular. And what's more is that based on your level of devotion, i.e. how many monuments or temples you build to your chosen gods, you also receive better bonuses from them. As you unlock devotion slots through the royal decrees, i.e. the tech tree, you can even gain favor with several gods at once, and choose which god you want to build new temples to. Although it's also possible to convert the worship of individual already built temples, which is a nice touch. For the most part, it's important to build temples because of the positives they give you, especially when your devotion to the god is high. But I wish they had more of an impact on the campaign somehow, perhaps giving you better diplomatic relations with characters who worship the same gods as you. But other than the mechanic itself, I again want to devote some attention to the UI. I see what CA is going for here, but these massive windows just take me out of the game. I don't know whether it's poor contrast, weird formatting, or what it is, but I find that too much space is used to convey relatively little information, which the Devotion tab is absolutely guilty of. Diplomacy is an integral part of Total War and Total War Pharaoh, especially since Choice Resource System returns. We have no official trade agreements anymore, but we can create single or turn-based barter agreements, essentially allowing us to trade or demand resources for a set number of turns. I've always liked the system, as it at the same time allows you to build up your faction as resourceful as you can, while making sure you can rely on trading partners should you need to. What is a shame though, is that no trade is actually depicted on the map. If you're trading with another faction, there are no tiny caravan or ship models physically leaving and entering your cities, which really takes a lot of the immersion and charm away here. Further, I would have loved it if we had an official trade agreement mechanic as well, perhaps one that was essentially needed to be able to trade in the first place. This could generate goodwill between factions, especially neighbors, if there was a sort of diplomatic range mechanic, and perhaps organically net a few gold pieces for tariffs or taxes as well, and could make it so that we could regain our lost caravan and ship models on the map, which I hope you realize by now that I really miss. Speaking of immersion and models, the fact that city models don't organically spread or become larger either naturally or over time, or as you expand your main settlement building, is also a massive missed opportunity, and despite having seagulls flying around, really does make this map feel less alive than it so easily could have been. Pharaoh continues the Total War tradition of factions not really wanting to create non-aggression pacts with you, which is fine on its own, but it's not backed up by a system telling you why. Except for the numbers, of course. I'd love to know the factors why a neighbor doesn't want secure and safe borders with me, for example, with factors as simple as something like strategic interests, historical enemies, and past behavior, mixed with the already existing reliability system. As Pharaoh's entire system is near identical to Troy's, it also lacks that leap we saw in Three Kingdoms, which honestly, in a game about a civil war and the degradation of society, with court positions and intrigue, could have worked so well in Pharaoh. All I want in Total War games is to diplomatically vassalize or even annex my neighbors, but in Pharaoh, they either never want to join me, or somehow they offer up their own freedom willingly out of nowhere, even though they're stronger than me, and somehow, even when this character is the Pharaoh, they're still my vassal, with no repercussions. It's great that I can receive random offerings from them, but it's a weird scenario nonetheless, and I hate that vassals can still conduct their own diplomatic policies, waging war on other factions and forcing their overlord to make difficult choices. I don't understand why CA insists on taking one step forward and 4 steps backwards, but here we are, again, for no good reason. Now, just like Total War Attila, Pharaoh revolves around instability and a system of degradation. As large and important cities are destroyed, so is so-called civilization, and the less civilization we have, the worse things get. The world turns darker, and the mysterious sea people barbarian hordes arrive to ruin everything. I think it's an interesting system, and it definitely works to provide you that extra challenge, as you suddenly have to face enemy hordes you might not have planned for. It's also great that it's possible to turn the tide and bring the light of civilization back. The only thing though, is that for me, the loss of civilization prosperity kind of feels like it's happening too fast, or at least its depiction is too harsh. A few dozen turns in, and the map goes from looking like the actual world, as beautiful as it is, to basically being constant darkness. Now you might think that because Pharaoh has options for his campaign, that you can turn this visual darkening off, but no. Pharaoh admittedly does let you determine a whole lot of things for his campaign, from how quickly your armies move to whether you can trade with other factions, and you can even turn off the Sea People's invasion entirely, but not this darkening effect, for, let's admit, a more historical view of the world. Massive kudos for these options though, I really like their extent and hope they become mainstays in the series. Lastly though, the perhaps one glaring missing piece of the puzzle in Pharaoh is the lack of naval battles. There is so much darn ocean here, and it's beautiful to boot, although I very much could do without that one obnoxious wave that ruins the rest of the gentle flow. And I mean, the Nile is such an important part of the Egypt experience, and I just imagine how awesome it would have been to use the Nile much more strategically. Imagine fighting those river battles, setting up crossing blockades, and I'm just thinking of how awesome it would be to fight off Hittite naval invaders from the north or even the Sea Peoples. I don't care if they would have to fiddle with a bit of the naval technology. Whatever they need to do to make it fun, let's say a simplified or bare bones version of the Rome 2 naval battles, would at least have been an option. And I mean, we can't even recruit navies here at all. let alone play them on the high seas or the narrow river straits ourselves. Creative Assembly desperately needs to bring back naval battles, because it really says a lot about the degradation of features and pillars of Creative Assembly civilization, if you will. That's such a massively important part of warfare, and past Total War titles, mind you, are still nowhere to be found. Now, when it comes to the general size of the campaign map, I have no inherent issue with the scope here. CA wanted to do an Egypt, Levant, and Anatolia campaign. That's fine with me, even though it would have been nice to have Mesopotamia and Greece in here as well. But that's just not the scope here, so honestly, I won't linger on what Pharaoh is not. But what I will say is that I find that we actually have too few cities to manage for the size of this map, especially when we can't raise our own forts, found centers of trade, or find resources of our own. That's basically the gist of Pharaoh's campaign, and even though the character abilities, royal traditions, and court aspects will vary from culture to culture and so on, this is for the most part the experience you'll get. And I'll say this, I can see the love here. I really can see the passion and dedication behind these systems. Honestly, just like Troy, I somehow see the effort put in, and I think a lot of what's in Pharaoh works quite well. I like how various buildings work together in symbiosis to create more wealth and resources. I generally like the trading system and resource system from Troy that's been brought back. I think the outpost system, although a half-baked version of what I really want, is a step in the right direction. I like how meaningful character equipment can be for your armies. I love the caravan royal tradition system in particular, and really feel like it should be a base mechanic for all factions. And I think it's great that becoming the Pharaoh actually gives you some meaningful bonuses. But Pharaoh's campaign lacks so much too. First and foremost, a clear identity and ambition of its own. It looks, sounds, and feels just like Troy does in so many aspects you think it was an expansion pack. Its UI is at the same time uniform while being all over the place. The music, while often pleasant, is not distinct enough to create its own identity and sound, and I guarantee you that you will not be listening to the soundtrack in a year, let alone 10 or 20. Diplomacy AI feels old, province design feels old, the royal decrees that return from Troy, which is basically a tech tree, feels old. This world feels less immersive than it looks at first glance. Once again, Total War is character based instead of kingdom based, and somehow, this might just be the first strategy game ever where I feel a sense of ludonarrative dissonance. As Ramses, for example, even though I understand he wants to be Pharaoh, I don't get any motivations or character background served up here, and it feels kind of awkward to just out of nowhere attack my neighbors and go on a killing and conquest spree. Seriously, I've never felt like I wanted to wage war less in a Total War game, and that is a messed up situation to be in when you're dealing with something as important as the stability of Egypt and the collapse of civilization by rabid invaders. Literally, it's so weird to me because, yes, this is technically a historical game, but it just doesn't feel grounded at all. The more I think about it, the more I feel like the original Rome Total War from 2004 is the best Total War ever made, because it actually innovated with deep mechanics, but mechanics that never cluttered the screen or confused your eyes. It was all there in plain sight, using a simple UI and intuitive systems. Trade ran on the roads and on the seas, generals got trades based on their actions, you could build forts out in the world, populations grew, and it all just appeared to happen organically without the need for massive UI windows filled with symbols and text. And that literally comes from a man who spent hundreds and thousands of hours learning and loving Paradox games, where UI windows is all there is. But here, in Total War, it just doesn't work the same way, and I feel like CA desperately needs to return to its former, now long-lost philosophy of simplicity in complexity, meaning the systems are there, but they're not constantly shoved down your throat. Because isn't that really the best way to go about things? Knowing that you could do all of these things, but that you don't have to wait a few moments to open and close every dedicated menu window in the world? I know I'm ranting here, but for some reason, my love of simple yet complex UI and UX just isn't fulfilled in Pharaoh, which is extra sad to admit when I loved Troy's UI so much. As an added cherry on top of this thing, we even returned to a strictly 1 versus 1 multiplayer campaign experience, when literally a year and a half ago, Warhammer 3 gave us the opportunity to play 8-player online campaigns. Can someone explain to me how it's possible to move backwards like this? Because I have no idea how this is justifiable. There is another half of Total War Pharaoh, of course, and that is the battle map. Now if you thought the campaign was inspired by Troy, then Pharaoh's is essentially a frame-by-frame rehash. And listen, I'm not saying there aren't new systems here, I'm not saying the battles are never fun, because they certainly can be. I think CA Sofia has managed to create interesting settlement layouts that enable invasion from several avenues, which is great, and this goes for both small villages and larger cities, meaning we get to experience a 360 siege experience again. And truly, some of these battle maps look amazing, with varied environments and layouts, and I love how even city maps present rivers and forests and just beautiful terrain. CA Sofia knows how to model their battle maps, that much is clear, but sadly, it feels like the systems around the maps hold them back. You see, Pharaoh still allows soldiers to club down massive bronze gates, making siege engines less vital for conquest. Burning down forests around enemies is definitely cool in theory, but I'm not finding it to be a game changer, especially because it doesn't seem to do as much damage as I wish it did. I hate the arrow trails, and I wish they had put more effort into making the arrows themselves more visible. And further, the way arrows and stones from slingers fly just never feels as realistic and quick as they do in Rome, Medieval 2, or even Rome 2. And while the visuals look decent, it just looks too clean and plasticky, looking identical to Troy, and again, for some reason, the close quarter combat just doesn't feel right. It just doesn't. It's hard to explain, but the way soldiers move, the way they hit, the way they blob, the way they sometimes almost fly off from a slash, it just doesn't sit right. The absolutely best thing about Pharaoh's battles though is that CA Sofia has really taken the quick battle criticism to heart. Pharaoh's battles might just be the slowest I've ever encountered in a Total War game in the best way, because now unit morale lasts longer, and it makes for much longer and potentially more tactical battles. It's a shame that the AI can't quite keep up here though, and sometimes makes weird decisions, like sallying forth in a siege battle when they shouldn't, have several units just stand and wait even though they could really make use of them, and so on. But this new morale system is definitely noticed and appreciated. I also appreciate the inclusion of unit stances, but to tell you the truth, it doesn't actually feel like they did all that much at the end of the day. Maybe I didn't use them right or something, but they never felt like game changers to me. I had some battles where they might have made a difference though, where I managed to hold the enemy off in a choke point scenario. But since the ability didn't tell me whether it increases morale, defense or whatnot, I never knew if it just kept my units in a tight formation or if it actually helped me out in other ways. When it comes down to it, I feel like the Bronze Age is an extremely wrong choice for a Total War game. And the reason is simple. Warfare is extremely basic and boring compared to later time periods. This is not Creative Assembly's fault, but it is their fault for choosing this time period to set their game in. In essence, Pharaoh offers about a handful of different unit types, ranging from swordsmen to axe and spearmen, javelinmen, bowmen, slingers, and chariots. Now this might not sound like the worst amount of classes. After all, a game like Rome might only be able to add light and heavy horses, elephants, pikemen, hoplites, dogs of war, pigs of war, catapults, onagers, you get the gist. Pharaoh's unit selection, because of the Bronze Age, is so darn limited from the get-go that it doesn't allow for the fun I crave for my Total War battles. And in the end, it does come down to wanting to have fun while playing these battles. The fact that we effectively lack cavalry units, even though chariots do make up for it to a certain extent, is a massive loss. But remove also siege artillery, and the scope has already been severely limited. What's worse is of course that within these cultures, units generally look relatively similar to each other, meaning there's even less flash and eye candy. Now I'm not saying that the models can't look cool, they certainly can. But I am saying that to get me to play longer and keep on loving it, this just isn't it. And again, I largely attribute it to the erroneously chosen Bronze Age, not to CA's depiction of it. I honestly haven't encountered a lot of bugs in these battles, which is great, but I do wonder about chariots, because even though they're supposed to be range-based, and even in skirmish mode, they too often rush extremely close towards the enemy and accidentally begin fighting them physically, which does admittedly suck. I commend CA Sofia for listening to feedback and bringing in unit banner carriers, and to draw new unit cards which, seriously, why aren't these 2D cards not the default option? Hello? I do wish that the look of the cards actually corresponded to how the units actually dressed on the battlefield though, because it is disappointing to see units in certain colors not at all look like their battle map counterparts. On their own though, these cards are great, but honestly, now that everything else is so beyond the pale, they're minuscule additions in comparison to the mountain of unfulfilled Total War potential on display. Personally, I don't know if CA Sofia modeled the engine themselves and made this the foundation for both Troy and Pharaoh, but I am almost certain that they haven't received the time nor the funding to reimagine this engine and make it feel heavier and more tactical. Tiny changes have been made, yes, but seriously, a complete and total overhaul of the entire Total War Warscape engine is what is not just needed, but required here, demanded here. And until that is done, I really don't see this getting better. Somehow, the battles of Warhammer 3 feel better than this because at least there, we're dealing with monsters and fantasy units that are allowed to feel like they have a bit more spring to their step and fizz in their jumps. And honestly, what saved Troy was the Mythos DLC, where at least then, we got units that changed up the monotony of Bronze Age Greece. But Pharaoh has no inherent saving grace that makes it better than any other Total War. And because of this, the aspect of Total War that should be the cream of this experience somehow often becomes the one you don't care enough about to play. And that is insane. Perhaps Total War Pharaoh will be a surprise success and live a long and happy life. Perhaps the modding community will embrace it and manage to change a thing or two. Honestly, I wish nothing but the best for Pharaoh and its future. But sadly, the fundamental design philosophy of modern Total War and its engine seems to me to be tripping on its own legs here, and have been doing so for a while. Because I love the addition of complex systems in Total War. I love its immersive aspects and the focus on intricate campaign details. But I don't love the way Pharaoh portrays them. I don't love the user experience of opening taxing windows that overshadows the entire campaign map. And I certainly don't like that we're still essentially playing Rome 2 10 years later, but with the added addition of character-based factions and systems that feel less strategical and less historical than they did in 2013 or especially 2004. On its own, Total War Pharaoh is not a bad game. If it's your first Total War game, I'm sure you can have a perfectly great time and admire the effort that's gone into making this a grand experience with a bunch of choice and avenues for expansion. Total War Pharaoh just might be the best Bronze Age game depicting ancient Egypt and the Levant ever made, and it certainly has the production value to back that up. I mean, I've had fun myself, and when you get your resource production going and use the outpost bonuses to the best of your ability, Pharaoh can certainly feel very rewarding. I've had fun in multiplayer, and being able to fight over these same systems within these cultures, or between them, is great. The game even comes across as really polished on release, both in terms of major bugs, but also in terms of generally keeping excellent performance targets. But as a Total War fan first, as a lover of immersion and organic gameplay, and as someone who wants my gameplay mechanics to feel real, and as though my options and decisions are natural to the world, Pharaoh almost couldn't be further away from what I want. In my opinion, they somehow managed to make it work in Troy. But here, with so many things identical 3 years later, but with characters lacking motivations, natural allies and enemies, and with almost none of the charm and simple complexity of the historical games of old, I can't love this game. And it's a shame to say as someone who loves Total War games and want to see this series succeed more than most game series out there. To tell you the truth, I was fine with Troy. I love the Mythos expansion, and I saw it as a testing ground for future experiments that could only become better and more detailed. But with Pharaoh's design ending up as it has, with 10 years and counting of essentially Rome 2 logic, I've honestly never been more depressed about the state of this series, even without the current drama going on at CA. I really hope the company can turn around and make this series into what it has potential to be. I really do. But we'll have to hear it from them first, see it first, and play it first, before that change actually happens. So if you wanted more of the same in a different part of the world, with a few changes here and there, you just might love Pharaoh. But if you want and hoped for that mythical return to history and the feeling of classic Total War, then you're gonna be disappointed. And just like with the Pharaohs of old, it's high time CA ends the use of this version of their engine and finally mummifies it. Cheers.